I work as a consultant at the Community Media Advocacy Centre, and our main mission is to help communities that are marginalized, that includes Indigenous communities, to finance and build media outlets, and to also fight for their right on the existing media spaces in Canada. It's been over a decade of criticism by the Indigenous communities for the Human Rights Museum kind of downgrading the genocide of the Indigenous people. Although the museum gives a big space to the story of the Indigenous people in Canada and Canada's complicity in the crimes that happened, it did not refer to what had occurred as a genocide, but as a cultural genocide. One of the main problems with that is, first of all, the museum is built on a sacred land, Indigenous sacred land, that was not excavated enough to show the burial grounds that were there, but although that it has even the little excavation that was done before building the museum, there was tens of thousands of artifacts that were recovered, making it one of the most artifact-rich sites in Canada. The other thing is that because it was supposed to be a Canadian Museum of Human Rights, the fact that the largest section of the museum is dedicated to the Holocaust, which is a huge crime that occurred in World War II, but did not occur in Canada, that was an issue for many, not only the Indigenous community. What happened to the Indigenous people in Canada was a genocide. In fact, it was the first biological warfare that ever happened in history. The Canadian government purposefully infected blankets and gave in trade to Indigenous people to ethnically cleanse the land in order to allow a speedy settlement process. This is one aspect of the genocide that happened to the Indigenous people, this biological warfare. The other is the purposeful kidnapping of the children of Indigenous people through the residential school systems, where thousands upon thousands of Indigenous children were killed, tortured, to try to stop them from speaking their languages and or acting in their cultural ways or practicing their religions. And even in the 1960s and 70s, the Canadian government enacted what became known as the 60s and 70s scoop, where the Canadian government forcefully took Indigenous children from their families and gave them to white families, therefore severing the ties of those children to their ancestors and their language and their culture. We need to actually refer to the international definitions of things that were there in international law and in humanitarian law, and that is not exclusive to specific race or nationality. This is the way to move forward, to accept a global human vision when we are trying to stop any future genocides or war crimes from being committed. Scientists have proven that trauma, specifically of genocide and war crimes or oppression according to race or nationality, are carried through to the next generation through the genes. So this is what we call multi-generational trauma. The main issue that the Indigenous people are having to deal with is that there has not been any disruption yet of the continued discriminatory policies that the Canadian government enacts against them. And there are still Indigenous communities that are far away from the main population centers of Canada still don't have the basic services, water, electricity, schooling, health. So it accumulates over and over, and you add to it the fact that the media in Canada is mainly not interested in projecting a positive image of Indigenous people in the media, which makes Indigenous children, when they grow up and watch television and seeing only rarely seeing an image of themselves, and if they do, it's an image of crime or death. The Canadian Broadcasting Act states clearly that all the media, whether it's Indigenous or not, has to produce and content that reflects the Indigenous communities, has to provide employment to Indigenous members of our country, and to be able to produce that content also. And so when we do a quick scan of most of the corporate and or the government sectors of broadcasting, part of my work is to help Indigenous people license their own independent media outlets in the radio and television sector, and to also lobby the Canadian government and the Canadian Radio and Television Commission, the CRTC, that licenses and governs the broadcasting in Canada, to move forward as fast as possible and to deliver on the legal requirements that are there within the Broadcasting Act and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Responsibilities.